overwhelming number of people in Afghanistan and their government, as with the United States, are of that ilk. And those are the people we ought to assiduously make sure get this money, and for that reason would be opposed to the amendment and appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Chairman, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
How much time do I have?
I was just going to tell you 30 seconds.
Thank you. That's enough. All you have to do is look at the top with Mr. Karzai and his brother who was killed, who was one of the main drug runners down there and who was killed. The whole country from the top to the bottom is corrupt. I thank the gentleman for his thoughts. You can't find honest people there to see that this money gets to their people. They don't care about their people. They care about their own power, their own money, their own riches. They are corrupt, and we are throwing this money away. Let's face reality and pass the amendment.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Arkansas.
Nothing further, Mr. Chairman. We are strongly opposed to the amendment. We yield back our time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Like to request a roll call.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee will be postponed.
Sure.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 30, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 30, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. COFFMAN of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. COFFMAN, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Mr. Chairman, last year this body in the FY13 Defense Authorization Bill specifically prohibited the Department of Defense from using any taxpayer funds to purchase Russian-built Mi-17 helicopters for the Afghan Special Mission Wing. One reasoning was simple. The Russian export company involved in the deal, Roscoe Boron Export, had an established track record for aiding our adversaries, having supplied both Iran and Syria with advanced weaponry for the years prior. However, despite our entirely reasonable objections to using taxpayer dollars to fund our enemies, the Department of Defense was intent on circumventing the will of Congress. The language in the bill prohibited the use of FY13 funding. DOD responded by using unobligated FY12 funds, circumventing the will of Congress as expressed in the law we passed and the President signed. On June 16th of this year, DOD awarded a $553.8 million contract to Roscoe Boron Export for the purchase of 30 brand-new Mi-17 helicopters. Last month, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, released an audit of the Afghan Special Mission Wing, and their findings were shocking. The very first sentence of the audit reads, and I quote, "The Afghans lack the capacity in both personnel numbers and expertise to operate and maintain the existing and planned SMW fleets. Finding recruits who are both literate and have no known association with criminal and terrorist elements is incredibly challenging." The Afghan Special Mission Wing, or SMW, was stood up in July of 2012 in order to provide air support for Afghan Special Forces, executing counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism missions, many of which are flown at night. Further complicating the issue is the fact that the pilots assigned to the SMW, less than 15% are qualified to fly night vision goggles. The vast majority of counterterrorism missions take place under the cover of darkness. My bipartisan agreement reduces Afghan security forces fund by $553.8 million, an amount equal to the contract DOD entered into with Roscoe Boron Export for 30 Mi-17 helicopters, and increases the spending reduction account by the same amount. Frankly, My preference would have been to rescind the FY12 dollars that DOD used to circumvent the will of Congress and enter into this deal. But an amendment of that nature would be subject to a point of order. The amendment forces DOD to reallocate resources if they want to continue down this path. Mr. Chairman, I am not debating whether this helicopter is ideal for the rugged terrain of Afghanistan or whether it is an easier platform for the Afghans to train on and execute missions. There seems to be an overall consensus that the fact is that it in fact is. My concern, and the reason I introduced this amendment, is that the United States taxpayer should not be paying for 30 brand new helicopters when A, they don't have the pilots to fly them, B, they don't have the trained personnel to repair them. In fact, SIGAR reports that only 50% of the current wing is airworthy due to a lack of maintenance. And C, Congress explicitly prohibited DOD from entering into this agreement in the first place. Furthermore, the DOD is asking the American taxpayer to spend over $700 million a year to maintain these helicopters, and that spending is not scheduled to end in 2014 when we pull out our forces from Afghanistan. Additionally, the Pentagon just announced last week that the purchase of Russian-built Mi-17 helicopters will not end with the 30 they just purchased for the SMW. Their plan is to equip the Afghan Air Force with an additional 86 brand new Mi-17s. If you consider that the cost of 30 helicopters was over $500 million, this new purchase will be well over $1 billion and probably $1.5 billion. This, for a helicopter the Afghans have proven they lack the personnel to fly and the capacity to maintain. I urge my colleagues to support the COFFMAN, Garamendi, Murphy, Cohen amendment. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For purpose, the gentleman from Arkansas rise.
Claim time in opposition, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the intent of the amendment's sponsor is to reduce the Afghan National Security Forces Fund by over $550 million in order to limit the purchase of Mi-17 helicopters. And I'm pleased that my friend from Colorado at least acknowledged that he was not going to argue with the purpose of the helicopters and the need for the helicopters because, as we all know, a properly trained and equipped Afghanistan National Security Force is the safest and quickest path for our forces to leave Afghanistan. Reducing funding from this account will only inhibit our ability to achieve the goal. The amount that the amendment seeks to cut, over $550 million, is for the purchase of 30 Mi-17 helicopters that were purchased with fiscal year 2012 funds, and Congress was later notified of the Secretary of Defense's intent to exercise the purchase on April 1st of 2013. So, Mr. Chairman, the reduction of funds are being taken from a prior year allocation or a prior year appropriation, which makes this amendment just simply a punitive amendment to this year's funding. So we oppose the amendment. We reserve our time.
The gentleman from Colorado's time has expired, so the gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
I have nothing further, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question now is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. COFFMAN. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Colorado.
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 33, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 33, printed in House Report Number 113-170. Offered by Mr. Garamendi of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, and the member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had a lot of discussion here in the last several minutes about Afghanistan. This amendment follows along the same line, but it's actually far greater in dollars. Last year, we appropriated $5,100
million to Afghanistan National Security Army for their support. In this year's budget, an additional $2.6 billion was added for who knows what. $2.6 billion of American taxpayer money for something, airplanes, supplies, support equipment, trucks, unspecified, unknown, to be used by one of the most corrupt governments in, the most corrupt government in the world. $2.6 billion of American taxpayer money for something unspecified to be used somewhere, somehow, I suspect more likely in some bank account in Bahrain. What are we doing? What justification is there for $2.6 billion of additional expenditure for the Afghan National Army? Have we lost our minds? No, we're just going to lose our money. What is going on here? What are we doing? What is this all about? This money should never be spent for some unspecified purpose. We take our Department of Defense and we hold them to a very tight account. We don't let them spend money without a contract, without reviews by the Inspector General, reviews by our committee, but here's $2.6 billion, unspecified. Oh, Mr. Karzai, use it wisely. Come on, let's not do this. This amendment would simply say you can't have that money. I reserve the remaining time.
Gentleman from California reserves his time. For what purpose the gentleman from Arkansas?
Claim time in opposition, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the Afghan National Security Forces includes both the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, and has been one of the United States' top priorities since operations began in Afghanistan in 2001. The purpose of the Afghan National Security Force Development Program is to grow the capacity and the capability of the Afghan National Security Force in line with international agreements. This year's request totals $7.7 billion. The request is further delineated into the categories of defense forces, interior forces, and detainee operations. Included within the categories is the base request for operations and sustainment to conduct day-to-day operations totaling just over $5 billion, and an additional $2.6 billion for the enablers that my friend refers to in his comments from the well, and says that, if I heard him correctly, that we don't know what these enablers are. Well, we do know what these enablers are, and people that have backgrounds in security or military would understand the importance of howitzers or night vision devices, or regional military hospitals, training and logistics and maintenance expenses, and a host of other associated items that we refer to in this legislation as enablers. The Department of Defense has taken steps to right-size the funding needed to support the needs of the Afghan National Security Forces. The core request is indeed the right amount. Calendar year 2014, Mr. Chairman, will be the last year that a large U.S. troop concentration will be in Afghanistan. The years to follow, the Afghan security forces will be there as the frontline force, thus helping to protect the U.S. and NATO troops against our foes. And with that, we remain opposed to the amendment and reserve our time.
The gentleman from California has 2.5 minutes. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it difficult that our esteemed Appropriation Committee, who watches the taxpayers' money with such ardor and intensity, would increase by 51% the amount of support that the American taxpayers are giving to the Afghan National Security Forces, the police, which are they are the most corrupt, and the Army, which is questionable, and certainly the government, which we know to be the most corrupt in the world, would simply write $2.6 billion more money than we were giving them last year, a total of $7.6 billion, for something. Something unspecified. We would never do this for our own military. Never would we do that. We would have them lay out how they're going to spend the money before we would even consider giving them the money. And then we would hold up to tight account. I cannot understand why we would do this. There is no justification other than, oh, we're leaving and we got to help them. So throw some more money at them. They already have been appropriated $52 billion, and only $40 billion of that has been spent. There's $12 billion left in the account. And you're going to add $7.6 billion to that? What are you doing? What justification is there for this, other than, oh, they may need it because we're leaving? They're going to use it for, let's see, other things. Well, maybe for some field hospitals, maybe for some airplanes, maybe for some supplies, maybe, but there's nothing written. There is nothing written. Oh, yes, we know the American Army or the American military will somehow spend it wisely. There is a 10-year record of it being spent unwisely. $2.6 billion. What could we do with it? Reduce the deficit? Could we build some levees? Could we educate some kids? Could we do some research in the United States? Come on. Of all the things we're doing here today, this is the most disgusting. And I yield back my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
May I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
3 minutes. The gentleman has 3 minutes.
Won't take that long.
Gentleman
Mr. Chairman, first of all, we have the list. And I recognize that the gentleman has argued that while there may be something printed on the list on paper, that how would we know that it's actually going to go for those purposes? I get that. But let me also remind the gentleman that this was all in the President's request as well. So it's in the President's request. Be happy to yield to my friend.
How many times I've heard from this side that the President is wrong and the President is wrong in this case?
So I'm assuming if the gentleman would admit that the President is wrong in this case as well.
He most certainly is wrong in this case, no doubt about it.
Mr. Chairman, I would just simply say, reclaiming my time, that we have the list. The list are certainly items that would go to the very core of the capability of the Afghan National Security Forces to be able to protect themselves and to protect us as we continue to prepare for leaving that theater of operations. So we are strongly opposed to the gentleman's amendment, and at this time, having no further comments, we'll yield back our time.
Yields back. The question is on the amendment offered from the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The opinion of the chair is the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Request a roll call vote.
Gentleman from California. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. The chair understands that amendment number 34 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 35, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 35, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Fleming of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment is fairly simple. DOD is permitted to appoint military chaplains, individuals who minister to the spiritual needs of any and all members of the armed services in accordance with the current DOD policy. Chaplains must possess appropriate educational credentials, 2 years of religious leadership experience, and more importantly, must receive an endorsement from a qualified religious organization, attesting to the tenets of the endorser's faith. In June, the members of this body, Democrats and Republicans alike, twice affirmed that the military is not permitted to appoint atheist chaplains. Despite these recent votes, it's been confirmed that the military is considering the possibility of appointing an atheist chaplain, completely bypassing Congress, the voice of the people, and current DOD standards. Since the formation of the chaplaincy in 1775, chaplains have been affiliated with the faith and spirituality. By definition, chaplains minister to the spiritual needs of our men and women in armed services, a vital function that an individual without any inclination towards spirituality would not be able to perform. I would like to thank my colleagues, Representatives Forbes, Bridenstine, Jordan, Pitts, and Langford, for their support of this amendment, and I would also urge all of my colleagues to support the chaplaincy of the U.S. military. I thank you, and I reserve my time. And I would like to yield a minute.
The gentleman reserves.
Oh, I'm sorry.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek?
I'd like to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in opposition to the Fleming Amendment, and I think there's a basic misunderstanding here about the needs of people who lack a particular faith tradition. I would also point out that we already ordain non-theistic chaplains in our military, including Buddhists, a non-theistic faith. Some Unitarians may also have a non-theistic faith tradition. However, over 20% of the members of our military identify as non-believers. And while, of course, their needs should be catered to by members of the chaplaincy from diverse faiths, it's only fair to have their humanism or outlook represented. Now, why is this different than the reason a member of the military might seek support from a medical professional or a psychologist, as the gentleman has argued they should? Those are different needs. A psychiatrist or a medical professional is not equipped to answer those kinds of existential questions that a member of the military might seek out discussing with a chaplain. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? How do I justify the use of force? People who are non-theistic in their outlook and humanists wrestle with those same existential questions as those of us of faith. So I strongly encourage my colleagues to not adapt an amendment that would be restrictive on the military. Now, to be clear, the military has not announced plans to move forward with ordaining humanist chaplains. But what this amendment does is it locks in place a 2004 rule, placing it in statute and preventing the military, even if they feel the need should arise for the good of the chaplaincy, from having the flexibility they need to appoint humanist chaplains. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my good friend, Jim Bridenstine.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Fleming, for your leadership on this. This is a very important amendment. I support this amendment to prohibit the appointment of atheist chaplains. My constituents back in Oklahoma are shaking their heads. The secular left is so invested in ripping God from everything that I must stand here with my friend Dr. Fleming to prohibit Obama's Department of Defense from establishing an oxymoron: atheist chaplains. Mr. Chairman, military chaplains have a duty to faithfully serve all service members and facilitate the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment. As a Navy pilot with combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, I recognize that war affects all service members, believers and atheists. However, those without a faith have plenty of options, from counselors to psychologists, to seek emotional support. Why does the secular left insist on ruining the integrity of the chaplaincy to serve their agenda of institutionalized godlessness? I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, a member of the Armed Forces Committee, Mr. Andrews.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Our intent is not to promote institutionalized godlessness. Our intent is to promote constitutional fealty. When a young man or young woman raises their right hand and swears allegiance to this country and agrees to serve in the armed forces, they do not consign themselves to be a second-class citizen irrespective of their faith or their life philosophy. It is wrong to say to a soldier who comes from such a tradition that he or she, if they have an issue in which they're troubled, must go to a mental health professional in order to receive counseling, rather than someone who comes from their philosophical faith or tradition. The other problem with this amendment is it frankly second-guesses the military leadership of this country, the Pentagon of this country, the Defense Department, and says that even if they would decide that such a decision would be appropriate, they're prohibited from doing so. Our law recognizes that our Constitution establishes no religion. We should have equality of treatment for our armed forces. I'd urge a no vote on this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield to my good friend Doug Collins from Georgia for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Who is, by the way, a chaplain himself.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding time. This is an interesting amendment, especially for me, because I am currently a chaplain in the United States military. I appreciate the arguments that have been made here, but let's just bring back something that needs to be made. And then when we deal with this in the contradiction of terms, a chaplain is there to provide services and spiritual guidance and a guiding hand, if you would, to all, those of faith and those with no faith. And that is done in a confidential setting, and it is done in a way in which the person who brings to the chaplain their feelings, their needs, and their conversations are kept in that inviolate conversation. What I'm here to do is to support this amendment because I believe it attacks the basis of the chaplaincy. It attacks the chaplaincy as a whole, this introduction into the DOD to bring an atheist chaplain, to really at the heart of the chaplaincy itself. I think it is beyond more than just do those who have no faith have a place to go. It's not about that. I believe it's about the faith of the chaplaincy as a whole and the standards that have been set up. I believe if a chaplain is doing their job right, then they are there. Could I?
Have 30 more seconds. I yield.
Gentleman's recognized with an additional 30 seconds.
If a chaplain is doing their job right, then all feel welcome. When I was in Iraq, I would go across and see everyone at night. And I had many times those who profess no faith at all and would come to me and say, Chaplain, I don't believe there is a God, but I have a wife at home that I'm having trouble with. Can you talk to me? That's what a chaplain does. This amendment reaffirms the establishment of our chaplaincy, and I believe that is what it protects. And it protects those with faith and those without faith and those who are somewhere in between. This amendment needs to be approved, and I yield back.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
With this, and I appreciate the gentleman for his efforts on behalf of the chaplaincy. I agree with his interpretation of the rules and responsibilities of the chaplaincy. And we try to represent the diverse faith tradition of the men and women who serve. In that faith tradition are those who look at objective fact, free thinkers, humanists, atheists. They too have the same mentoring, spiritual, existential needs as others. And of course, just as Catholics have to handle the needs of Jews and Muslims in the service, and Buddhist chaplains handle the needs of others. They're all trained to handle the needs of soldiers. We also want to make sure we have a chaplaincy that reflects the broad diversity of belief systems. Over 20% of today's members of the military don't believe, have a theistic outlook, are non-believers. And that's an important thing to have represented in the chaplaincy. Many major universities have humanist chaplains. Hospitals have humanist chaplains. Many of our allied European militaries have humanist chaplains. There is no, as one of the other gentlemen argued, there is no political goal or secular agenda here. We simply want to make sure the military is not prevented from providing chaplaincy services to the men and women who put their lives at risk defending our country every day. Every man and woman who serves should be able to, when the need arises, have a private consultation with a chaplain, and we should include in the chaplaincy people who represent the full diversity beliefs of the quality of the men and women who serve. Increasingly, there are seminaries that prepare humanist chaplains for ordination and work in the field, in hospitals, in universities, again, in the militaries that have them. I personally hope that this is a direction that our military considers in the future. We ran a similar amendment that would move it in this direction to an authorization bill. 150 members voted for it. I'm confident even more members will want to vote against restricting the military from moving in this direction. Again, to be clear, the Obama administration and the military has given no indication that they want to go this way, but as we reassess our ongoing personnel needs and how best to support the men and women who serve, I believe that many members of the military will come to the conclusion that this is an excellent way to do this. I urge a no vote on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
1.5 minutes. The gentleman from Louisiana still has.
Thank you. Well, first of all, with all due respect to my good friend from Colorado, there is no way that an atheist chaplain or atheist whatever, can minister to the spiritual needs of a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, for that matter. I'm sorry, I'm not going to have the time to do that. And so as a result, that is the whole problem here. When you're talking about a chaplain, what are you talking about? How do we define chaplain? A chaplain is a person who ministers spiritual needs, but who is assigned to a secular organization. You know, the military is 99.9% secular. The only thing that we add to it that is non-secular is the chaplaincy. And also I would say to you that there's a limited number of chaplains, and if we begin to displace chaplains who are actually from religious organizations with those who are atheists who do not believe in spirituality or a deity, then that's going to limit even the number that's going to be available to the others. So again, it's nonsensical. It's an oxymoron. But as I've said before, and I'll say this again, remember that an atheist is a person who does not believe in a deity, does not believe in a spiritual world. It's impossible for that person, through his or her beliefs or training, to minister to the spiritual needs of somebody who does. But in the final analysis, I believe that an atheist chaplain would be the last person in the world that we would want a dying soldier who needs that last moment counseling in their life. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. All time expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
is agreed to.
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 36, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 36, printed in House Report Number 113-170, offered by Mr. RIGELL of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. RIGELL, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chairman, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise to speak in support of my amendment, which would prohibit any of the Afghanistan Infrastructure Fund to be used to begin new infrastructure projects. Now, there are a host of amendments that will address current projects. That's not the focus of my amendment. My amendment is focused on new projects. And, Mr. Chairman, I have in my hand the summary of an audit provided to Congress on July the 12th by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And it contains key findings that really make the case that my amendment is needed. The opening paragraph states this: more than 10 years after the international intervention in Afghanistan, the U.S. government, the international community, and the Afghan government continue to face challenges in implementing programs to build basic infrastructure. And that's certainly consistent with what I observed firsthand during my trip to Afghanistan. It goes on to say that 5 of the 7 infrastructure projects for fiscal year 2011 are up to 15 months behind schedule. In USAID, the lead agency of this effort, certainly doesn't need to be taking on new projects when it can't get control of its current projects. And really of far more importance, and what is so deeply troubling, Mr. Chairman, is what is stated at the close of that same paragraph. And quote here, it says, in some instances, these projects may result in adverse counterinsurgency efforts. Now let that sink in, Mr. Chairman. The Inspector General is making clear to us that the American taxpayers' dollars may be funding infrastructure projects that actually work against our counterinsurgency efforts. It goes on to state the two reasons why that might occur. First, these projects create an expectations gap among the affected population. And second, they lack citizen support. Look, even the Afghanistans don't want some of these projects. The harsh reality is this, Mr. Chairman, while we're furloughing hardworking Americans who work alongside and support our men and women in uniform, we have poured not millions, but literally billions, $89.4 billion in reconstruction efforts, and really into a cauldron of graft and corruption. It's not the way to spend America's tax dollars. Mr. Chairman, it's time to stop building infrastructure in Afghanistan. Now, finally, the Inspector General's report makes clear that we are building infrastructure that the Afghanistans cannot possibly maintain and sustain. They don't have the money, and they won't have the money. Buildings will deteriorate. Generators will run out of fuel. Lights will go out. Yet we keep building. We keep adding to the national debt. Look, we're hiring Afghanistans and laying off American workers. This doesn't make any sense, Mr. Chairman. It's time to stop building infrastructure in Afghanistan. And that's why I urge my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, to look carefully at this issue. I believe that will lead to a vote for my amendment, which would prohibit any of the Afghanistan infrastructure funds to be used to begin new infrastructure projects. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition? Does any member claim time in opposition?
I claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this is another in a line of amendments that we have debated here this evening. And I hate to be repetitive, but I am going to be. And that is, we and the international community failed the country of Afghanistan in the last century. Today, both in terms of the loss of life, in terms of injury, and in terms of our national treasure, we're paying the price. For over a decade, we have now had a commitment to this country, and we ought to meet that commitment at the end just as we did at the beginning. The gentleman wants to prohibit essentially any new projects from commencing. I think it is important for our colleagues to understand that there are a number of very important projects that do need to be undertaken and completed. And all of them involve basically power systems. I don't think there's anybody in this chamber who has not at one time or another lost power to their home or their business. It's something we all take for granted as American citizens. If any of you have read the Carroll biography on Lyndon Johnson, in the first volume, I was most struck by his chapter describing the day in a life of a woman in Texas with no energy, and how hot that house was, and how hard it was to bring that water to that house. and how difficult it was to make sure clothes were cleaned and food was prepared, and how exhausted and bent and broken these women were in the state of Texas before rural electrification took place. I think there are a lot of people in the country of Afghanistan today, because they lack power, that they are bent and broken and potentially subject to being persuaded that there are other avenues to take in life for a better one, as opposed to the principles that our country espouses. I think particularly for those women who are bent and broken because they have no power in the country of Afghanistan, we ought to give them a fighting chance at the end. We've been fighting in that country for 12 years. Let's give them a fighting chance at the end. Let us undertake some new construction to give them that chance. Simply because we have failed in some instances in this country is not, again, as I have said before, a reason we should fail others. And I see the gentleman from California rise. I would be happy to yield to him.
I join the gentleman in opposition to this amendment. I understand the gentleman's concerns about what has happened in Afghanistan, is happening in Afghanistan. Many of us have been to Afghanistan many times. That country was totally destroyed by the Russians during the prior wars. They were left with nothing. It's probably, if not the poorest, one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth. Rubble on rubble. And when we leave, and we are going to leave Afghanistan in 2014, what we're saying is that we're going to give them the basic parts of energy production, which is what the primary source of this money is going to develop. So I reluctantly oppose the gentleman's amendment and join the gentleman in his opposition.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I would reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I appreciate the comments of both of my colleagues. I certainly don't agree with them. However, if I understood the gentleman correctly who led in opposition, and I do want to get this right, and I'll yield if I don't get it correct, but I made the notes here that you said, the gentleman said that we've failed the nation, the people of Afghanistan. Look, is this? Yes, please.
I don't want to fail them.
Don't want to. Thank you for the clarification. By any measure, we won't and have not and will not fail those people, because we have sacrificed so great a measure of treasure and loss of life. We have met every obligation to the people of Afghanistan, and look, our principal and primary and exclusive obligation, of course, is to the American people. The best indicator of future performance is past performance. We have not demonstrated competence as much as we've tried, and good people have given their all. In fact, some of our civilians at USAID, as we all know, given their life in this effort. But we have not demonstrated a competency to advance these projects. And here are the facts on the economy. The entire revenue stream for the Afghan government's about $1 billion a year. We've raised up a military operation there, the Afghan Army and Police, the largest employer by far in the country, that has an annual expenditure of about $7 or $8 billion. Look, the math doesn't work. We've created a structure here that's going to require, absent some difficult decisions, a sharp reduction of expenditures there. And I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized. Gentleman from Indiana yields back. The question is on the amendment from the gentleman, offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It's now in order to consider amendment number 37, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 37, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the amendment I bring forward is a very basic, straightforward, common-sense amendment that deals with the funding priorities within the Department of Defense. We know we're living in a post-sequester world. We have many hearings here on Capitol Hill where we've got generals and, in fact, even the Secretary of Defense talking about the threats to military operations through the sequester cuts. And we all know that those are real, and especially in these tight economic times, and even if we weren't in tight economic times, but especially right now, we ought to be watching every single dollar that's spent within the Department of Defense and work to find ways to make smarter use of those dollars. One of the things that we've found as we've combed through is that the Department of Defense has been entering into contracts to buy renewable fuels, biodiesel, and other forms of renewable fuels to supplant what are the traditional conventional fuels. The problem is that the contracts that they're entering into are tremendously more expensive to the taxpayer than if they just bought conventional fuel. And so what this amendment would do would be to say that the Department of Defense cannot enter into those contracts to buy non-traditional fuels at these higher costs. And I want to give a couple of examples. I think it's important to note a few of them because this is something that's been happening recently that we found. There is a memorandum of understanding between the Navy, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Energy for each of those entities to spend $170 million each to, quote, assist development and support of a sustainable commercial biofuels industry. Now, Mr. Chairman, whatever you think of expanding and developing a biofuels industry, that's not a mission of the Department of Defense, and especially when their budgets are being cut and the generals and the Secretary of Defense is saying that they don't have enough money to form and execute their basic military operations. Yet they're spending $170 million to prop up a failing biofuels industry when they could instead be buying traditional fuels. Just want to give one example of what we call this renewable energy sticker shock. Here you've got furloughs at the Pentagon. The military has grounded the Blue Angels, and yet they have a contract right now to buy renewable jet fuel at $59 per gallon, $59 per gallon, when the traditional cost of conventional jet fuel is $3.73 per gallon. And yet the military, to carry out some kind of social agenda, is spending an extra $56, almost $56 more per gallon so that they can buy renewable fuel. And so this is one example of many where the military is not making the smartest use of their military dollars at a time when Secretary Hagel himself has testified before a committee that the services have begun to significantly reduce training and maintenance of operating forces. So if they're reducing the training and maintenance of operating forces, why are they spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up a renewable energy industry that's clearly not viable yet? One day it will be, but today it's not, and yet they're spending, in some cases, 5, 10, 12 times more to buy this renewable energy than they can buy for conventional, wasting hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. And this amendment just says that has to stop. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose the gentleman from Indiana rise?
I'll move to claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Appreciate the time. I would begin by pointing out that the Department of Defense is the single largest consumer of energy in the United States of America. And I certainly do believe that we need to move from a carbon-based economy, particularly given some of the countries in the world where we procure carbon products such as petroleum. Many people talk about it as an economic problem, and it is. Many people characterize it as an environmental problem, and it is. We're talking about the national defense today, and I certainly agree with former Senator Richard Lugar from the state of Indiana, who has always characterized our dependency on foreign petroleum as a national security issue. This is the perfect bill to have the largest consumer of energy begin to reduce our dependence on these very countries that have cost us so much of our treasury and so many of our lives. This amendment would defund Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act. The fact is, the argument is made that this hurts our readiness, and that is not the case. In July, the Department of Defense stated very clearly, and I am quoting the Department, "The provision has not hindered the Department from purchasing the fuel we need today worldwide to support military missions. But it also sets an important baseline in developing the fuels we need for the future," end quote. The gentleman would indicate that there's nearly a 20-fold difference in the price of renewables and the price of petroleum at the pump today. The price of $3 and some cents a gallon, unfortunately in some jurisdictions $4 a gallon, can be purchased very close to this building. Many of these fuels have to be transported to places like Afghanistan. There's an additional cost that is worked into that 20-fold increase. And additionally, I do not think we need to complicate the Department's efforts to provide better energy options. We want to give our warfighters as many options as possible when they are in the field to take advantage of. This section also does not prevent the sale of petroleum products, nor does it prevent federal agencies from buying these fuels if they need them. Instead, it simply prevents the federal government from propping up the makers of these types of fuels with long-term contracts when we're trying to wean ourselves from them. So I do think that the amendment should be opposed, and I do so, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana recognized.
I'm prepared to close. I will reserve until that time.
Gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from...
I'm prepared to close, Mr. Chairman, so I'll reserve until the gentleman's completed with his...
It is my understanding I have the right to close.
Yes, that is correct. The gentleman from Indiana has the right to close.
All right, then I'll close, Mr. Chairman. And the gentleman makes an important point. When he says that the Department of Defense is America's largest user of energy, then I think it's even more important that they watch every penny. And so, you know, I've got hardworking taxpayers, soccer moms in my district that will drive an extra 3 blocks just to save a penny a gallon on gasoline because they can see that price at the pump and it matters to them. If they can save a penny a gallon, they'll drive a couple of extra blocks. And yet you've got the Department of Defense, the largest user of energy in the nation, according to my friend, saying that they're willing to not drive an extra block to save money, they'll drive a couple extra blocks to spend $59 a gallon when they can buy that same jet fuel for $3.73 a gallon. Again, another contract, there was a big high-profile production on the Great Green Fleet where they flew some planes on renewable energy, cost an extra $10 million just for that one example. Again, they're flying the Blue Angels, they're grounded right now, and we're out there flying jets that run on algae and cooking oil, spending hundreds of millions of dollars more than if you use traditional jet fuel. And so while I applaud the gentleman's effort to support renewable energy, that's not something the Department of Defense should be wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on when the Secretary of Defense has said that we actually are right now significantly reducing training and maintenance of operational forces. We should take that hundreds of millions of dollars we'll be saving with this amendment and provide it for our troops, for the support they need, because right now it actually risks our troops' lives. It's a 50% higher risk for them to be transporting renewable fuels than it is to transport traditional fuels because of the density of that renewable fuel. So it puts them more at risk. I would urge support of this amendment. Let's save those hundreds of millions of dollars and dedicate it towards our nation's security. I yield back the balance of my time.
Has expired. Gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Indicated my opposition to the amendment, and I, at this point, yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment by the gentleman offered, from the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 38, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 38, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Terry of Nebraska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise because of 650,000 people in my district, 4,400 employees who serve at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, are being used as political footballs. Programs like the Section 526 that we just heard the gentleman from Louisiana discuss, that mandate that the Armed Services spends entirely too much money on fuels. Section 526 also bans our military from using other traditional energy sources like oil sands from Alberta or even coal to liquids. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer my support, though, for the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mr. Texas, Mr. Flores, who has done this amendment in the past. To me, it's not about who gets the credit or who reaps the rewards, but that it just gets done. I'm tired of the Pentagon using civilian workers on base as a political football and then spends the money that they do on fuels. So by working together to cut waste from this bill, like Section 526, we can find ways to protect our constituents who have devoted their lives to serving the men and women who wear the uniform. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. It's now in order to consider amendment number 39, printed in House Report 113-170. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 39, printed in House Report number 113-170, offered by Mr. Whitman of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 312, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that I have before you today provides that none of the funds in this year's Defense Appropriations Act may be made available to propose, plan, or execute an additional base realignment and closure round, better known as BRAC. Remember, we have a current BRAC in place that continues to cost our nation dollars in the defense budget. Now, I want to remind folks, too, that this same language passed in this year's National Defense Authorization Act by a vote of 315 to 108 on June 14th, and it says this. It says that we want to make sure that we're making the right decisions in the context of what's going on around us. We have an existing BRAC that will not save a penny until 2018. The original cost savings estimates on that BRAC were $21 billion. Today, the cost of that BRAC is estimated at $35 billion, and the nation won't break even until 2018. In fact, in this year's President's budget, the estimated cost of that BRAC is $450 million. Now, we wouldn't want to proceed with another BRAC with potential cost savings somewhere in the future while we're still paying for the additional BRAC, especially in light of the budgetary needs that are before us with our nation's defense budget, with the sequester going on, with those reductions, and with the uncertainty surrounding the current state of affairs with our national defense. Why would we want to continue in the realm of uncertainty, spending more dollars with an uncertain future about when savings would occur when we haven't even accrued savings from the 2005 BRAC? Again, just not the time to go about this time to put in place another base realignment and closure commission. And, Mr. Chairman, at this point, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
I seek to claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. I note that the gentleman's amendment says that none of the funds made available by this Act may be used to propose, plan, or execute an additional base realignment and closure round. If the gentleman had simply said today we should not execute that next additional base realignment and closure round, I would not have stood on my feet. But the fact is, he said we shouldn't propose or plan either. He also indicated that because we are today paying, I believe, some hundreds of millions of dollars for the current base closure, we should not consider paying for another one. But the question I would ask rhetorically, not necessarily of my colleagues, is don't we have to sometimes make an investment for the future? That is, there are cleanup costs, there are close-up costs, there are demolition costs, and those are short-term costs. But potentially those are investments year in and year out for decades where this nation's taxpayers can save money. And where the gentleman says we shouldn't consider another closure, and at this point I'm not aware that there is a proposal pending, what if we could save money by doing that? Should we simply say no? Should we just say no to everything? Is it wrong to consider how we might look at every last base and military facility in this country to save taxpayers money? Essentially, the gentleman's amendment says it's wrong to look at them. It would be wrong to propose to the Congress that has the authority under Article 1 of the Constitution to decide whether then we execute that proposal. Is it wrong for an administration to look nationwide where we're spending almost $600 billion for a more expensive Department of Defense but not a larger one, that says we have a plan and they send it to the Congress, but we can't even do that, so we can't have a discussion. We can't have an open and free debate. We can't even, would not be allowed under the gentleman's amendment to say, you know what, you got a plan, but we could make it better. We could make it more efficient. We could amend it, but we're prohibited from doing that. I think the time for simply saying no, 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 no is gone, and I think the gentleman's amendment is wrong, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.